What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking about some free agent wide receivers, trying to predict where they could possibly land in this free agent market. The reason why we're doing this and why I think this is applicable for fantasy football is because if you currently roster some of these wide receivers, or maybe you're thinking of trading for some of these wide receivers, I think it's best to try and get a grasp on the market, get an idea of where these players could land. That way you can kind of see the range of outcomes for what is possible here this offseason. Now, this is going to have a lot of projection, but there is going to be some takeaways as far as teams that could be landing wide receivers, how that's going to affect the competition in those rooms, XYZ. You guys kind of get the deal. This is a little bit of a fun episode, but I do enjoy these ones, so hopefully you guys enjoy it as well. If you do, make sure to hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's talk some free agent wide receivers. All right, so I've compiled a list of possible teams that could be in the free agent wide receiver market. Now, things that have been taken into account to get to this list has been either team need, looking at that depth chart, vacated opportunities, things like that, cap space, and also draft capital. So looking at the league, obviously there's a lot of teams that could use a free agent wide receiver. We are going to be talking about the top 7 names in today's video, but that leaves you with this grouping of all of these teams. Now, there's a lot of them, so we need to kind of eliminate some of these teams to kind of get a more likely case scenario. When I'm looking at these teams, looking at teams that could be turning into teams that will be in the free agent market, I think we can eliminate the New York Jets, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Buffalo Bills, the New Orleans Saints, the Indianapolis Colts, and the Cleveland Browns. Now, the reason why I'm eliminating some of these teams, the Saints, when it comes down to it, cap space. They're negative 47 million in cap space currently right now. I don't imagine that they're going to be spending a lot on a free agent wide receiver. Same with the Cleveland Browns, negative 24 million in cap space. The Buffalo Bills, negative 10 million in cap space. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, only $9 million in cap space. Plus, with Mike Evans and Jalen McMillan on the roster, I don't think that they're going to be super pressed to go out and pay for a Chris Godwin replacement, because I think they drafted their replacement with Jalen McMillan on the roster last year. The Indianapolis Colts, they do have some cap space, $35 million, but I think with their current team, with Michael Pittman Jr., Adonai Mitchell, Josh Downs, Alec Pierce, there's enough players in that wide receiver room where they're not necessarily going to go pay for another big name guy after paying Michael Pittman last year. And then last but not least, the New York Jets, currently only $15 million in cap space. They have Garrett Wilson and they have Devontae Adams currently. What they're going to do with Devontae Adams, I don't know. If they move on from him, maybe they could be in the free agent market, but right now I'm not projecting it as such. So who is that actually going to leave us when we're looking at a free agent market, and who is going to be the true wide receiver market really for this grouping? To me, the Cincinnati Bengals, the Arizona Cardinals, the Houston Texans, the Los Angeles Rams, the Carolina Panthers, the Baltimore Ravens, the New York Giants, the Green Bay Packers, Las Vegas Raiders, New England Patriots, Washington Commanders, Denver Broncos, Pittsburgh Steelers, Tennessee Titans, Dallas Cowboys, Chicago Bears, Los Angeles Chargers, and the Kansas City Chiefs. All of these teams have the positional need, they have the cap space, and they have the ability to go out and pay for a free agent wide receiver. At least one of these top 7 free agent wide receivers we're going to be talking about here in today's episode. So that is going to take us to our first overall player that I want to dive in and I want to talk about. And that player for us is going to be the number 1 wide receiver on the market this year, maybe on the market this year. It's T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, when I'm looking at T. Higgins and I'm looking at this contract, all of these numbers are pulled from Spotrac or Spottrack, however you guys want to say it. I think it's Spotrac because it's sportscontracts.com. Now, they do have a lot of data to back up these projections, and it does give us a calculated market value. So when I'm looking at this right now, they're projecting at 26 years old for T. Higgins, a $25.4 million average annual salary. They're saying somewhere around 4 years, $101 million. Now, the comparable players and how they got to this number is when you're looking at historic numbers: Brandon Ayuk, Justin Jefferson, Amari St. Brown, AJ Brown. These are kind of the types of contracts that we have seen guys like T. Higgins get. So when I'm looking at this and I'm looking at teams that could possibly pay for T. Higgins if he hits the open market, there's a couple options. I'm going to give you guys a primary option and a secondary option for each of these players. The primary option to me, though, is going to be the Cincinnati Bengals. Look, I don't imagine that Cincinnati allows him to hit the open market. I don't think he's actually going to even hit the open market. I think he'll be franchise tagged. If anything, they've kind of already talked about that. You've seen some of the stuff on the internet right now of T. Higgins saying it's cap that the GM for the Cincinnati Bengals doesn't necessarily want to pay him. But overall, this is a team that needs T. Higgins. Joe Burrow's been vocal about wanting T. Higgins back on the roster opposite Jamar Chase, and he's also talked about wanting guys like Mike Gesicki back on the roster. I think at the end of the day, the failed experiment of Jermaine Burton is really what is forcing them to go back out and probably use the tag again. I think Jermaine Burton, had he come in as a rookie and really exceeded exceeded expectations and shown that he was capable of being that first round type of talent, even though, you know, he fell late in the draft last year for character concerns, which did show up at the NFL level. If that had panned out, maybe they would have been allowed to move on from T. Higgins this offseason and not paid him the contract that I think that they're going to have to pay him. But I think the most likely scenario and the primary option, and probably the only option for T. Higgins in this free agent market, is going to be Cincinnati back on the franchise tag. Now, when you're looking at other options, I want to give you guys a secondary option. Say they don't, for whatever odd reason, and I'm wrong, that they do choose to move on from T. Higgins in Cincinnati. I do think the most likely scenario is going to be the New England Patriots. Now, the New England Patriots, to me, when I'm looking at cap space, they lead the league right now, $129 million in cap space, and they also have a team that needs an ex-alpha number one type of wide receiver. Drake May, obviously the quarterback of the future there in New England. Right now, he's throwing to virtually nobody. We've kind of heard that they may not like this rookie wide receiver class as much as we thought that they did. There are players like Ted McMillan that we thought maybe could be here in New England. I don't necessarily know if that is the case anymore. So we'll see what happens with the New England Patriots. When I'm looking at it, if there's anybody that's going to land as the alpha for Drake May, it's probably going to be T. Higgins, and this would probably be my secondary option for T. Higgins if he hits the open market. So we'll see what happens. I don't think he's going to. I think he gets tagged by Cincinnati, but overall, those are my top two plays here, or I guess my top two options here for T. Higgins. Let's move on to our next player. Our next player here is going to be Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, Chris Godwin, he's an interesting case because obviously got hurt last year. He was kind of recovering from being hurt just a year before that, or 2 years before that. I can't necessarily remember off the top of my head. But when you're looking at a 29-year-old wide receiver, obviously having a very good year right there, former third-round pick, they're projecting $22.5 million. That's a market value of 3 years, $67 million total. You're looking at the comparable players, some of these comparable contracts, guys like Calvin Ridley, Brandon Cooks, Mike Evans, Stefon Diggs. We'll see what happens overall, but I think there's a lot of scenarios where Chris Godwin makes sense. It was actually kind of hard to break it down to just a top two because I think he is the most likely number one option on the free agent market, because I do think that T. Higgins gets franchise tagged. I don't even think he hits the open market. And if Chris Godwin does hit it, to me, the best option, the primary option where I think he lands, is going to be the New England Patriots. Now, I said it, T. Higgins going to New England, they needed a alpha wide receiver. They need a number one wide receiver. If he doesn't hit the market, New England has the money to spend. Like I said, $129 million in cap space. Chris Godwin would make a great wide receiver option for Drake May. This is a guy who can play all over the field. He could be the security blanket for Drake May, and I think he gets the money to go to New England. I don't necessarily feel like Chris Godwin is going to be the guy that feels like at this point in his career, he has to chase a contending roster to go find a championship type of team. I think he's more than happy to take the payday right now while he can, and I think New England can offer that payday. I think this is a great scenario for him. I think he is, like I said, the number one wide receiver that actually hits the market if you account for T. Higgins. And if he goes to any of these places, it's going to be one of the places that has the most money to pay him and has the biggest need probably at wide receiver in the NFL currently, and I think that's the New England Patriots. So let's move on to the second option. To me, that's going to be the Los Angeles Rams. Now, we've heard about the Los Angeles Rams wanting to move on from maybe Matthew Stafford, wanting to move on from Cooper Kupp, actually planning on moving on from Cooper Kupp. Obviously, as I'm filming this, Matthew Stafford is still the quarterback for the Los Angeles Rams. I expect that to remain true, but even if Matthew Stafford does move on from Los Angeles, they're going to need another wide receiver opposite Puka Nacua here, and if Matthew Stafford moves on, they may be going to get a guy like Aaron Rodgers into this offense, which I think he would like a guy like Chris Godwin if he doesn't bring along his teammate Devontae Adams with him. Now, that being said, Chris Godwin, he would fit perfectly in a Sean McVay offense. I think he could play that slot role for them very well, kind of like Cooper Kupp has played over the last couple of years, and at 29 years old, you could get a decent amount of time and a decent amount of value left from a production standpoint left in Chris Godwin for the Los Angeles Rams. So this is kind of a sneaky option for me. They're not necessarily one of the teams that has the most cap space in the NFL. They're more towards the middle of the pack, currently sitting at $43 million, but I do think it makes a ton of sense from a schematic standpoint and from a need standpoint if they are going to be transitioning from that Cooper Kupp type of offense to now Puka Nacua and maybe Chris Godwin. So let's move on to our next guy. The next player that I think we're going to be talking about is going to be Stefon Diggs of the Houston Texans. Now, he is going to be hitting the open market. Obviously, he suffered an ACL tear this year, 31 years old. That's a little bit concerning because suffering the ACL tear that late in your career at 31, teams are going to be nervous. They're not necessarily going to give you the type of money that they probably would have given you if you hadn't gotten injured. Now, that is going to mean that they are going to be projecting $13.5 million as the average annual salary. They're saying a 1-year prove-it deal is kind of the market value. Similar guys in this range would be like Tyler Boyd, Jarvis Landry. That's obviously on the lower end, but D-Hop, Tyler Lockett, those guys are kind of in the same type of ballpark. Now they got 2-year deals. Maybe Diggs does get that, but that would kind of make sense from the average annual salary standpoint. When I'm looking at teams that could use Stefon Diggs, there's a few that make sense. I think the one that makes the most sense for me, if Stefon Diggs still wants to chase money at this point in his career, maybe even a potential contending roster, I do think that the Washington Commanders make a ton of sense. Now, this is a guy, Stefon Diggs, who played his college ball in Maryland. It would kind of be a reunion in Maryland with the Washington Commanders, and he would be able to go play with a young quarterback in Jaden Daniels. He would have a ton of fun, I think, playing opposite a guy like Terry McLaurin. He would be the number 2 wide receiver in that offense, and they have the cap space, 3rd most in the NFL right now at $83 million. We've also kind of talked about the Washington Commanders having a lot of opportunity. We talked about Luke McCaffrey in an earlier video last week. They're going to be basically losing everybody in this offense. Noah Brown, Olamide Zaccheaus, Diami Brown, XYZ, every other depth wide receiver on the roster pretty much gone. It's just Terry McLaurin and Luke McCaffrey, so they are going to be potentially spending on some wide receivers, drafting some wide receivers, and I think paying for a guy like Stefon Diggs, who could be a veteran, to throw to for Jaden Daniels and play opposite Terry McLaurin would make a ton of sense, especially if you're trying to get some more weapons to go in and potentially go win that NFC. Now, we are going to be going on and talking about the next team, and the next team to me is the Houston Texans. I think there is a chance that this is just a reunion here. Obviously, Tank Dell dealing with the injury in this upcoming season where he's going to miss the majority of 2025. I think if the market isn't great for Stefon Diggs, if teams aren't wanting to pay a ton of money, I think he just stays in Houston, plays with CJ Stroud, keeps growing here, and gets to play with opposite Nico Collins. Overall, this is probably the top 2 destinations. I don't necessarily think that the Houston Texans are going to back up the Brinks truck. When you look at overall value from a salary cap standpoint, they only have about $4 million right now, which obviously they can kind of open up a little bit more cap space and make some more things happen. So like I said, they're not going to be paying a bag of money for Stefon Diggs to stay here, but if his market isn't as hot as he thought it would be, and if Washington and some of these other teams like New England and even teams like the Las Vegas Raiders aren't willing to back up a Brinks truck for a veteran wide receiver like Stefon Diggs, which, like I said, I think he probably takes that money, he just stays in Houston and keeps trying to win here with the Houston Texans. So let's move on to our next player. The next player on this list is Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper, obviously last year at 30 years old, being traded from the Cleveland Browns, going all the way to the Buffalo Bills. Now, he didn't have the best year with the Buffalo Bills. We all kind of felt like that would help the production, but his actual production got worse from his time in Cleveland to Buffalo. So it's interesting to see that he is projected a decent market value right now at $14.2 million. They're expecting 2 years, $28 million. I don't know if that's necessarily what he's going to get. Right now, if you're looking at just the back half of the year, I think a lot of teams maybe might feel like he wasn't a difference maker and maybe they're not willing to pay him a lot of money, but there is no doubt that Amari Cooper is talented. Kind of puts us in that same bucket of receivers, Mike Evans, Lockett, Brandon Cooks, Diggs, all of those guys being considered. This is an interesting player because he has a lot of ties across the NFL right now. Obviously, he's played for numerous teams, numerous coaches, XYZ. When I'm looking at places where he could primarily land, to me, the Green Bay Packers make a ton of sense. Now, Josh Jacobs has said that he wants to get a number 1 wide receiver, or he thinks that the Green Bay Packers need to go get a number 1 wide receiver. And keep in mind, Josh Jacobs and Amari Cooper, former teammates when they were with the Raiders. I think that there's a chance here that Amari Cooper reunites with Jacobs, a friend of his, a teammate of his, and goes to the Green Bay Packers where he can be the number 1 wide receiver there for Jordan Love. Obviously, they've talked about needing, some extra help there. Jaden Reed is a fine wide receiver. Christian Watson's a fine wide receiver. Dontavion Wicks is okay. They have guys there. Even Romeo Doubs is a solid wide receiver, but nobody can truly be the number 1, or has nobody really stepped up as the number 1. Green Bay with $48 million, I think, could afford a 1-year deal or a 2-year deal for Amari Cooper. And if that's the case, Green Bay makes a ton of sense to me, and I think he could land there potentially on a contending roster, a playoff roster, and still get number 1 wide receiver targets with a former teammate. Now, the second option to me would be the Pittsburgh Steelers. This is another team that's going to need to go get some wide receiver help this offseason. It hasn't necessarily panned out with just George Pickens. They've kind of been looking for another guy since Deontay Johnson left this team. Calvin Austin has played well in spurts. They went and they got a guy like Mike Williams, Van Jefferson. All of these guys aren't necessarily difference makers. Amari Cooper makes a ton of sense. With $59 million in cap space, you can go pay one if you're not going to go pay one of these top free agent quarterback, and just keep building around what you have in the building And I think that that's going to help here for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who obviously have been a wild card team. If you get Amari Cooper and George Pickens in this offense with maybe a rookie running back and bring back Justin Fields or whatever it may be, this makes a ton of sense. So I think Amari Cooper could potentially land with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And there were Amari Cooper Pittsburgh Steelers rumors not too long ago. I think it was just a year offseason ago or something like that, where Amari Cooper was rumored to be traded from the Cleveland Browns, and the Steelers were one of those destinations that popped up. So maybe they kind of rekindle this fire and rekindle those rumors to where Amari Cooper and the Pittsburgh Steelers actually make it happen this time. So let's move on to our next player. The next player in this list is going to be Keenan Allen of the Chicago Bears. Now, Keenan Allen, obviously the oldest, I think the oldest wide receiver of this bunch right now. This is a pretty old veteran wide receiver class in free agency this year. 32 years old, coming off of a year there with the Chicago Bears in year 12. Right now, the average calculated market, the annual salary is at $11.1 million. They're saying 2 years, $22 million. That's similar to what Amari Cooper is going to get, and that's that same bucket of players like we talked about. Lockett, Thielen, Hopkins, T.Y. Hilton here as well. That's a much cheaper contract than I expect Keenan Allen to get. I don't even know why that's being accounted for. Maybe just because of the age here at 33 years old. But overall, I think he's going to get close to that Adam Thielen or that DeAndre Hopkins deal. Now, when I'm looking at potential destinations, I don't see a lot that makes sense. There's really not a lot that makes sense to me. There's only two, actually. So I'm glad that we have a primary and a secondary option. But to me, the first and the primary option is reuniting, going back to Los Angeles with the Chargers. The Chargers currently have the 6th most cap space in the NFL at $66 million. Obviously, they need another wide receiver in that offense, kind of with Quentin Johnston and Ladd McConkey. This is a guy who played at Cal. He played for the Chargers. He's even said in a past interview that if he wasn't playing for the Chargers or the Bears, he doesn't really think he'd be playing much football anymore. Those are really the only two places that he said he wants to play for. So we'll see what happens here, man. I think the Los Angeles Chargers make a ton of sense. I think he could go back to Cali and kind of finish his career where it started with the Chargers now that they have Jim Harbaugh, and maybe that makes sense for them from a scheme standpoint and from a financial standpoint as they look for some veteran help in that wide receiver room. Now, the only other option I think is the Chicago Bears. I think maybe he re-ups here with Ben Johnson. I think there was a chance where if they didn't hire Ben Johnson, Keenan would look at the Chicago Bears kind of as a cursed franchise and say, hey, look, I don't want to finish my career here. I don't want to keep doing this. Even though he did play well for them last year, I thought there was a chance that he could leave. With Ben Johnson, it gives him a little bit more excitement. Obviously, he can keep playing with Rome and DJ Moore and Caleb Williams, who he did seem like he was a little bit of a help to Caleb Williams that year as a rookie, as a veteran presence. Maybe they make this happen again, another 1-year deal or a 2-year deal where they just bring Keenan Allen and say, hey, finish it off here with Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams. Like I said, there's only two places where Keenan Allen has really talked about wanting to play football. It's these two places. I think that's more likely he goes to the Chargers. I just think that they're a little bit of a better team right now. But if not, he comes back to the Chicago Bears. So let's move on to our next player. We are going to talk about Hollywood Brown, Marquise Hollywood Brown. 27 years old, year 6, from Oklahoma, former first-round pick. They're saying the average annual salary is $8 million. A 2-year deal for $15.9 is what they're projecting. Kendrick Bourne, Mike Williams, Darnell Mooney, Robert Woods, all of these guys got similar deals. 2024 was really a lost cause for Hollywood Brown. He was signed on that 1-year prove-it deal for the Kansas City Chiefs and basically had a rare injury that forced him to miss the majority of the year. There really wasn't a lot that he was able to put on wax. When you're looking at highlights, which you guys are probably going to see some of the highlights here, there's really nothing from Kansas City. It's his former days when he was with the Ravens and when he was playing with the Arizona Cardinals. So there's not a lot to go off of as far as last year's production, but I think that the best option for Hollywood Brown and the most likely scenario is that he just re-ups with the Kansas City Chiefs. Like I said, they didn't get to put a lot on wax. Maybe he just says, hey, let's run it back and let's see what we can actually do with a year of health. And I think that that's most likely the scenario. Having him in this offense, which was the plan with Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, Travis Kelce, and then Hollywood Brown being here, that is the plan that the Chiefs wanted going into the year. Obviously, that didn't pan out with the Hollywood injury and the Rashee Rice injury. I think that they just do it again in 2025. Let's re-up, let's rerun it back, let's try and go to the Super Bowl, and let's try and go get another one here. I think that's the most likely scenario for Hollywood Brown. And a good year with Kansas City would allow him to maybe go get some more money in the free agent market next year if he does just sign a 1 or a 2-year deal and doesn't want to stay with the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, the second option that I feel like could make sense for Hollywood Brown is going to the Washington Commanders. As I mentioned, the Washington Commanders at $83 million in cap space have the 3rd most in the NFL. They're going to be looking for some other weapons opposite Terry McLaurin to come in and help Jaden Daniels in this offense. I think Hollywood would be an awesome complementary piece to a guy like Terry McLaurin, and if you put him there with, Zach Ertz Hurts, maybe he comes back in free agency, maybe he doesn't. Ben Sinnott, Brian Robinson, Austin Eckler, XYZ, all of these other guys that are possibly there, and all the cap space that they have to keep improving this roster. I think Jaden Daniels with his big arm and Hollywood Brown's deep threat ability, Terry McLaurin's deep threat ability, this offense would be really fun, and it would be kind of a great consolation or a second place prize for the Washington Commanders if they don't land a guy like Godwin or land a guy like Stefon Diggs this offseason, who are obviously going to be kind of the more expensive options. I think Hollywood Brown is a less expensive option that still kind of gets the job done for the Commanders. Now let's move on to our last guy. I said we had 7. We're going to talk about Hollywood Brown's teammate. Going to be DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins at 32 years old, just like Keenan Allen, an old veteran wide receiver option that could be going to find some money. They have him projected at $15.2 million, which is probably more money than I felt like he was going to get. Now the cap space did go up. I think the max this year is at like $280 million. They are saying it's going to be a 1-year deal though, which makes sense at this time of his career, kind of how old he is. Christian Kirk, T. Higgins deal last year, Tyler Lockett, Jacoby Myers, those are similar contracts that they're pulling from to get that market value. But when I'm looking at overall the primary option, the best place for DeAndre Hopkins to go and play football next year, I think that's going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers. Like I mentioned with them when we were talking about Amari Cooper, I think Amari Cooper ends up going to the Green Bay Packers. The Steelers could still be looking for a veteran presence or another wide receiver to play opposite George Pickens. And I think a guy like DeAndre Hopkins actually reminds you a lot of kind of similar things that George Pickens does as a receiver, and he could learn a lot. George Pickens could learn a lot from DeAndre Hopkins. So you bring him here. This is still a team that is competitive. Like I said, playing in the wild card last year, could have the cap space, could have the winning pedigree, all of that stuff that maybe DeAndre Hopkins is looking for as a veteran right now, and he goes and plays with the Pittsburgh Steelers with a head coach and Mike Tomlin that is very well respected around the NFL. So maybe DeAndre Hopkins, he's been rumored to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers in the past. I think there's a lot of wide receivers at times who get rumored to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers, but there have been those rumors. Maybe they make it happen here with the Steelers in free agency this year as kind of a last payday for DeAndre Hopkins, especially if we're talking like a 2-year or a 3-year deal, maybe like the Jacoby Myers deal. So let's go to the secondary option. I think there's another play that could possibly happen. It's not necessarily going to be a winning organization, but if D-Hop wants some money, maybe you go to the Las Vegas Raiders, play with Pete Carroll, play with maybe a veteran quarterback in Russell Wilson or a rookie quarterback in Shedeur Sanders or something like that happens there. I think he could go to the Raiders with $96 million in cap space, putting them at the second most in the NFL. They could pay D-Hop to come in, and this just feels like a Raiders type of move. We know that the Raiders organization, their ownership, they like to make these big splashes, even if they're not necessarily the smartest plays for their roster at times. I think maybe the presence of Tom Brady, the respect that he has, could recruit a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, Pete Carroll being there, all of these things considered, DeAndre Hopkins ending up with the Las Vegas Raiders. It wouldn't surprise me. And like I said, with D-Hop, there's not a lot of options that I think could happen. I still think maybe he could go back to KC, but if they bring back Hollywood Brown, I don't know if they have the cap space to do that because Kansas City doesn't have a ton to work with. But overall, I think the Las Vegas Raiders and the Pittsburgh Steelers make some sense for DeAndre Hopkins as a free agent. All right, folks, so there you have it. Like I said, some speculation, but hopefully what you guys are able to take away from a video like this is potential landing spots, how I feel about those landing spots and how that could affect those players in those landing spots, how I value and how I kind of am viewing the free agent market for some of these veteran wide receivers and all of those other things considered. This is one of those videos that I think is a little bit more fun than it is informative. I think there is definitely some information to take away from. So if you felt like it was entertaining, informative, actionable, any of those things considered, you guys just enjoyed the content, make sure you hit the like button for me today after today's video. Make sure while you're down there, you also hit the subscribe button. We're working to get to 5,000 subscribers by the NFL draft. I think we can do it if you guys all hit that button for me, assuming it isn't already clicked. And if this is your first time at the channel and you haven't joined our free Discord, we do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with your Dynasty fantasy football teams 24/7, 365 around the clock, talking trades, talking leagues. Maybe you guys want to join some leagues with some of the members of our Discord, or just looking for more league mates for your already established leagues to take over some orphans. There's a lot of opportunities for you to find people to play fantasy football with and get better at playing fantasy football, just having a group of people to talk to. So make sure you go join that free Discord. With everything else being said, I don't really have anything else for you guys today. We will see you tomorrow for a Dynasty trade review show, a surprise one, a bonus one came this week. So hopefully you guys are excited for that. And then more free agent talk next week as we watch the combine this weekend. So we'll see what happens. I'll see you on the next episode though. Until then, peace out.